the role of statistics and data is fundamentally important for tracking, for policy assessment and evaluation, and for any policy reforms that need to be put into place. So your role as energy statisticians is fundamentally important in the coming years, which is why I think this training is so important. The IEA family is growing. This is the kinds of issues that we have to address in energy systems are shared problems that exist across all of our countries. We represent a high percentage of consumption and production of energy, but the percentage that we are representing through both membership and increasingly close relations with associates and with other countries is growing all the time. In fact, you're part of a network now of over 1,500 statisticians around the world who have taken these courses, developed shared interests, continue to share knowledge with us and with each other after the training. And we feel that is one of the most important roles that this plays. It helps us to all feel that we're part of a family, a network that will help us to make sure that the data that we have, the data that we provide to policymakers and to others is the most reliable, the most timely, the most robust possible. But it's of course a two-way street. I emphasize, and my colleagues emphasize to me all the time, that we get as much from you as you get from us in the course of this week. We learn a great deal. We also have then a community which helps us to populate our databases, what is in fact the global standard for energy data, to populate our databases in a manner which is consistent with the highest quality standards. So without further ado, I would just like to thank all of you for participating in this week. It's an honor for us to have so many people from so many different countries express their interest and willingness to do this course with us. I'm just having some difficulty moving the slide. One moment. Why do we collect energy statistics? Well, most of all, as I've mentioned, it's essential for all stages of the policy cycle to inform and design policies based on current and the current state of affairs and that which is foreseen in the near future. Adapt policy during its implementation. The data allows us, if necessary, to shift the boat in midstream if that proves to be necessary in order to ensure efficiency of those policy settings, and to understand policy performance, evaluate what happened and why it happened. There's a need for increasing cooperation among countries. I'm just going to very briefly shift my window so I can see this properly. My apologies for that. There's a clear need for increasing cooperation among the IEA family to address global challenges effectively. Raising the quality of global energy data and statistics also depends heavily on international cooperation. These are not words coming from us, these are words coming from our ministers. Our ministers have asked us to do this work, and by doing so, they've asked us to work with all of you in order to ensure that this work is undertaken. I'll just give some practical examples. It's one thing to say that it informs policy, but we have to think about it in a concrete way. All countries need to better understand the impact of market conditions and policy settings on a variety of outcomes of important policy relevance. IEA member, for example, IEA member countries have an obligation to hold 90 days of oil stocks, net imports over consumption. In order to figure out whether or not that is the case, in order to assess whether or not we have those 90 days, of course, very reliable and timely data is required on imports, consumption, and stocks of oil products. EU member countries, they have an obligation to a minimum share of electricity consumption from renewables. So we need reliable data on renewables. Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, we have to respect engagement of the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. So we need reliable data on both supply and demand to ensure that that is the case. And these are just some examples. A number of countries have made commitments most recently to net zero by 2050. If we are to be on a trajectory which gets us there, then clearly having the data in order to monitor on an annual basis is fundamentally important. Some basic principles associated with energy statistics. First of all, determine the needs. We're the suppliers and the demand is coming from elsewhere. We have to know what that demand is, and we have to be in a position to respond to that demand appropriately. In order to do so, we need to ensure that resources are allocated to collect and process the data. Now, this, of course, is a big concern. It's very difficult for many of us in the statistics community to get the resources we need in order to do the work that we are being asked to do. And that's a continual struggle. An important aspect of that is ensuring that there's a legal basis in place. The legal basis provides the stick, the framework by which we can ensure that we're able to allocate the necessary resources. But that's not always enough. And we have to think about new ways of working, new data sources, new ways we can meet the demands, increasing demands that we face. So an important issue is exploring the use of administrative data, but also other data, scraped data, self-generated data, data available in from commercial sources that allow us then to corroborate, to develop some of the other sources of data, to make sure that we're on the right path. Establish a proper reporting mechanisms. Questionnaires which are as user-friendly as possible, leaving very little space for ambiguity, preferably no space for ambiguity, and not making the cost of implementation, filling in the questionnaires, excessively burdensome. As I mentioned before, a network of contacts is fundamental. We have that network needs to grow, and it is growing. And then, of course, an agreed timetable. Establish the proper dissemination mechanisms. There's no point creating the data unless it's available to all of those potential users who can help us to make sure that our energy systems are efficient and the markets associated with them are efficient. Review the methodology and the process to anticipate and adapt to changes. It's a moving target. All of the work we do is a moving target. Sort of the basis for much of this, as many of you are familiar, is the International Recommendations for Energy Statistics. I believe it was published in 2011, but as a result of a long period of gestation starting much earlier in about 2005, 2006. This is something that is important for all of you to consider as your Bible, really, in some sense, and it is the basis upon which many of the presentations, all of the presentations that you'll be seeing today, have been developed. We need to ensure consistency. We need to ensure that there's comparability across countries, across sectors, across fuels, if we are to fulfill our mandates. So the principles of data quality. First of all, relevance. How does the data serve the needs of the users? Accuracy. How close is the data to the true but unknown value? Credibility. Is the data and the data provider trusted? Accessibility. Is the data easily available in a usable format to users? This is something which has perhaps been not sufficiently closely respected in the past. Many of our countries have started to implement significant programs to make the data more easily available to potential users. Interpretability. Is there scope for ambiguity in the meaning of the data? That's where metadata is so important. Data is just a number. If it doesn't have metadata behind it, then it cannot be considered a proper statistic or data point. Timeliness. What is the lag between the phenomenon to be measured, fuel share, an emission, whatever it might be, and the provision of the data associated with that? Coherence. Are different data points mutually consistent across time and countries? And then cost efficiency. Are we allocating the resources most effectively in order to generate the demand that is placed upon us? Energy statistics side of the IEA. It's the backbone of the IEA, really. And the timeliness of the data is becoming increasingly important. So there's two elements to this that I'd like to emphasize. Firstly, the nature of the data that we have to collect is changing because our energy systems are changing. Secondly, we need to be able to respond relatively quickly as possible, with accurate data, bearing in mind all the potential trade-offs that exist between those two targets, in the face of important changes. An example, of course, is the pandemic that has struck us all, which is the reason why, of course, we're having to hold this workshop virtually. This is the IEA family. It's a big family, 30 member countries. but 8 association countries, 3 accession countries, and I would say good relations with over 100 countries across the world, at least in terms of data. We produce a whole series of products. The products that we're producing are going through constant change while keeping in line the necessity of having consistency over time. So we develop new products, we develop new ways of looking at the data, but we need to make sure that the time series that we have continue to be comparable over time. Non-member data collection. I'll just say a few words on that because this is fundamentally important. We have a mandate with our members, or the members have a mandate, have given us a mandate, which gives them the obligation to collect data of different types and forms. But our work, of course, with non-members is based solely on cooperation. Cooperation that is, we hope, mutually beneficial, and we are convinced is mutually beneficial. The fact that you are all here tells me that it is mutually beneficial. As I mentioned, over 100 countries, 120 countries, and growing. This allows us to compile a world energy balance. So we can go beyond those countries who are obliged to provide us with the data to develop energy balances for others on the basis of cooperation. Collected in multiple formats, whatever the country can provide. We work with all of you in order to identify the best means to get the data into a form which allows us to make it comparable with other countries. In many cases, there's use of secondary sources and estimations when the country cannot provide the data. And there's communication with country contracts to help solve problems and confirm changes. Communication is essential. The Holy Grail. I've called this the Holy Grail. One energy statistics questionnaire for all. It will take us a long time to get there, of course, but we're already making significant progress in that regard. You can see the many regional and international organizations with whom we work in order to make sure that we're all working toward the same goal. Now, even if the questionnaire isn't identical in all different cases, it needs to be comparable at some level of aggregation. And that's where we devote a considerable amount of effort through our collaboration with the different institutions that you see listed here. I would argue that the IEA is at the heart of this effort to ensure that there's consistency across all these associations, just because of our very privileged position through the long history that we've had in this area. We also, of course, get outside energy in some sense, or the straight role of energy statistics, by supporting the global agenda in the realization of important global objectives. Sustainable development goals are a good example. We work in the area of renewables and energy efficiency, as well as energy access. My colleagues work in that area, as well as on the industry side, emissions in terms of value added. So we try to support international efforts with the development or ensuring that the indicators are robust and comparable across different countries. We're always looking for new sources of data. I give an example here of the Weather for Energy Tracker, which I encourage all of you to look at, which can be an important instrument that you can use in order to better explain what you're seeing in some of the energy data that you're collecting. And then we use this data. In part, anybody can use this data, of course, but we like to ourselves, in part, in order to make sure that the kind of work that we're doing is valuable, is useful, is meeting the demands of the countries, analyze the data in a deeper manner. And this is just an example where we took the weather data and applied it to look at the effect of lockdowns in the course of the pandemic in a number of countries. And we did this for some association countries as well, including India, for example. But I've just given one graph here, which shows the effect that the lockdowns had on power demand explicitly. Capacity building. This is an example of capacity building, but we have many other examples. We do trainings in situ, so to speak, in different countries and with different groups. Obviously, that has been curtailed in the last year or so, but we continue to do so virtually, and we feel that our efforts to do so have been successful in ensuring that despite the pandemic, we continue to build capacity in energy data and statistics around the world.